Hello, and welcome to this third short Beowulf introductory presentation. This presentation has less to do with reading the poem and more to do with how amazing it is that the poem exists at all, and especially how amazing it is and how miraculous it is that the poem exists in our hands. People often ask, where does this poem come from? And scholars, including famous Beowulf scholar George Jack, tells us that the origins of the poem are, quote, beyond recovery, which doesn't give us much hope. It wasn't a culture that wrote things down for hundreds of years, so it's very difficult to pinpoint exact dates. What we do believe is from a window that we're not quite sure of, but it probably ranges at some point from anywhere in the 6th, 7th century to the 11th century, from the 500s to about 1000, that window there. And there's a lot of dispute about the composition of Beowulf and its date. But what we do know is that the court poet of the time, the Shope of the time, would compose poetry orally to maintain the history of his tribe and to inspire the troops, to inspire the warriors to fight even more heroically the next time around in the next battle. It's about probably a 300 to 500-year-old game of telephone, if you've ever played telephone, which means that the notion of knowing what the original poem looked like is, quite frankly, a fantasy. All we have is what we currently have. The poem's origins are entirely cloaked in mystery. And that's something that's just important to accept, that the thing we have now is a much more recent version of this story than was probably originally crafted by a poet. What we do believe pretty strongly is that sometime around the turn of the first millennium, that the poem was eventually transcribed by a Benedictine monk, the community that transcribed all of Western sort of literature and civilization. There was a lot of debate in the religious communities of the time as to whether or not monasteries should have anything to do with pagan culture. But there's a lot of history, there's a lot of documentation about Anglo-Saxon English monasteries listening to pagan stories at table reading and sort of the pagan stories of their culture being a part of who they were and how they were educated. So you might know about the famous Henry VIII, and you might know that Henry VIII, famous king of England, father of Elizabeth, dissolved the monasteries in an effort to attain their wealth. The monasteries were known to own a huge percentage of the land and the wealth of England at the time of a younger Henry VIII, relatively younger Henry VIII. And Henry VIII's troops dissolved the monasteries. They basically just took what they wanted, including priceless manuscripts. If you talk to classicists, people that study ancient Latin and Greek, and you mention the burning of the Library of Alexandria to them, they often weep of just imagining what was lost. If you talk to medievalists, they weep at the thought of the dissolution of the monasteries and the priceless just relics that we'll never have back. We know sometime around the 16th century, the first named person to possess the Beowulf manuscript was a man named Lawrence Noel. The most famous owner of the monastery, and we'll get to him also a little bit later, is an antiquarian from the late 16th century, Sir Robert Bruce Cotton. He was an antiquarian. He collected old manuscripts, and much of what we know of Anglo-Saxon literature was in the possession of Robert Cotton. Now, Robert Cotton's estate was called Ashburnham House. Here's a practical tip from your English teacher. If you're going to collect ancient manuscripts, don't live in a place called Ashburnham House, because in 1731, Ashburnham House, true to its name, burned to the ground. Now, what I want you to notice here, this is the very famous first leaf, first page of the Beowulf manuscript. And you'll see the very first word, Huat we Garadena, and in Yerodagum. You'll notice on the edges, it's sort of charred. You can see the effects of the burning on the edges. In some of the later leaves, the later pages, the charring and the burning is much more pronounced. I mention this not simply because, not because it'll help you read the poem any better. It's just an interesting tidbit that almost all of what we have of Anglo-Saxon literature we have because it was thrown out of a window in 1731 because of a fire, and that's simply a fact. In 1815, the first edition of the poem was published by an Icelandic historian named Grimur Thorklin, the Thorklin edition of Beowulf. And this was the very first time it was put together in a bound volume as a sort of object of legitimate study. But in light of that, this is really important. Many of you know J.R.R. Tolkien as the author of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And those, by the way, if you like Beowulf, please read The Lord of the Rings. But in 1936, Tolkien, as you might know, was an Anglo-Saxon scholar. He was a scholar of this literature. That was his primary job. And he published the most famous monograph, the most famous article in the history of Beowulf scholarship, called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. And the article does a lot of things. And the most important thing the article does is it says that Beowulf doesn't exist, the poem doesn't exist simply as an object of archaeological and historical interest. It doesn't simply tell us who people were 1,000 years ago. It actually is a legitimate work of art in its own right. This article gave credibility to Beowulf as a poem and gave credibility to Beowulf as a poem worthy of study on the college level. Now, if you wanted to see the Beowulf manuscript up close, this document here, the manuscript's in the British Museum as Cotton Vitellius A15. It's called Cotton because it was last owned by Robert Cotton, the man we mentioned earlier. Vitellius A15 denotes how Cotton organized his library. He had bookshelves throughout his library full of ancient medieval manuscripts. And atop each bookshelf, there was the bust, the sort of marble, sort of mini statue of the head and shoulders of a Roman or Greek emperor. So we know that the Beowulf manuscript was in the bookshelf, which had the bust of Vitellius over it. It was in the first row, A, and it was 15 volumes from the left, Cotton Vitellius A15. I mention all this again, not because this makes you excellent readers of Beowulf, but I think it's important to be mindful of the fact that this isn't a book that originally was produced and one could just purchase in a bookstore without any effort at all. This book survived Viking invasions, the dissolution of the monastery, fires. The very existence of this book in your hand is a miracle. And I don't think it's a bad idea to read it with that in mind.